The views and opinions expressed in the following presentation are those of the individual presenter and should not be attributed to any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated.
Hi, I'm Faranak Kamangar. Welcome to the Future of Dermatology podcast. We're very excited to have you here again. We have a very interesting, amazing guest today. A quick, brief bio. I could go on for days about Vishi's bio, but just a quick bio. Vishi Hawkes is currently an associate director, thought leader liaison at Regeneron, and has been in the biotech pharmaceutical industry for over 23 years. She has a master's of business administration and lives and works in Northern California and has been a huge supporter of our dermatologists in the area. So Vishi, thank you so much for joining and for being here. And anything you want to add to your bio, your background, I'm so happy to have you here and just tap into your wealth of knowledge.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. That was an incredibly kind introduction, and it's such an honor for me to be here with you today.
Oh, it's so great to have you, Vishi. And one of the things that I've always loved talking to you about, and you have so much information on, is, of course, you've seen so many changes over time in medicine and dermatology and the therapeutics, and you have so much knowledge about the inner workings of sort of a different part of the healthcare system that we as physicians don't see every day. So I was hoping to kind of tap into a little bit of that. We can start broadly with just kind of what have you seen different in, this is sort of our Future of Dermatology podcast, but just in the recent past, what kind of changes have you seen within dermatology and therapeutics, systems-wide, gaps in care, anything that you've seen that we'd like to kind of start off with?
That is such a good question. I think it's this time of innovation in science and really advancing the therapies. So therapies getting not just that, on the precipice of this personalized medicine, but targeted therapies that are treating unmet needs. Conditions that didn't have good options now are having good options. That has definitely, in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been some really big strides in, discoveries. I think that also pushes to, how does that affect the entire system, right? So it's not just innovation, but, I think COVID was one example of that digital innovation to the theme of the podcast, but really having an opportunity to just continue to push with how can you get these innovative medicines to patients and potentially using some disruptive or innovative technology to help assist with the processes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've kind of talked about too with even other guests on the podcast is such an exciting time with therapeutics. It was in the past,
right?
Creams and topicals, and somebody would come in and that's where we would stop. Now we have these amazing therapies, and we're getting more and more of them, more data, more specific targets. So it's like the best era in a way, but then sort of the gaps and the things associated with the prior auth of getting them covered, working with the different pieces of insurance, PBMs, all these different settings, just even our healthcare settings changing of like a lot of doctors being in private practice and then having to shift to kind of working in these big groups just so we can kind of manage this data and all this extra steps that we have to do. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like we have all these great therapeutics and it's the best time to be in dermatology. But on the other hand, everyone is it's like a fire hose of the other end, just the logistics of it. Have you kind of seen that within your time being in like that change? Have you kind of seen that within physicians, where you're kind of really just seeing the practice models are changing? And
yeah, I absolutely have seen the change. And I think that's the elephant in the room, right? That's where if there's a way to solve that question, is how do you be more efficient with the processes that it requires on, you know, what we would say is pull through, right? And that's where, and you and I have talked about this, I think having the stakeholders really come together who are in the patient continuum of care and have these conversations is so important, because there's different resources that, or ideas that can come up that can really help with this, that inevitable requirement of actually getting patients treatment, right? And that's really where these conversations are so important to have between, again, the front line, which is providers, dermatologists, and, all the way to the manufacturers of the biotech pharmaceutical industry that is really with the patient at the center of that, right? How do we have the patient-centric conversations? Because that's the fundamental, what we fundamentally share.
It's really just getting all those stakeholders together, which is, I think I'm so grateful that you were able to come onto this podcast and talk to us, because we can have lots of different conversations with different physicians and put more and more episodes that way. But I feel like we're not going to solve these problems on our own as physicians alone, just because there's so many little pieces of it. And I also feel like there's a little bit of a lot of lack of education from the physician side on the background, what happens, what has happened to kind of get us to this point where we're having these extra kind of barriers, getting your patients what they need. So I love the thought of just like having them realizing who the important stakeholders are and then how to connect them. So I think that's like a really, really important piece. Sometimes we don't know all the holders. There are important ones and non-important ones, meaning like there's all these like connector things that happen between pharmacies and things that you never even really know from the time you write your prescription to the time where it may or may not end up with the patient getting that same prescription or a different one. So many little things that happen. And like, I feel like most of us don't know what happens at the back end now. But really and then once you figure out who the right stakeholders are, then how to kind of form those relationships, which I think you've been such a guidance for a lot of dermatologists of just how to interface with different groups, like who the right connections are that you need to talk to if you're trying to get a problem solved. And I think you've seen a lot of probably physicians that are just doing medical care, like in clinic, but a lot that are probably doing other roles too, like maybe even leaving medicine or engaging with pharma researchers. I'd love your thoughts about that, kind of the trends you've seen, or just specifics on how physicians can get more involved in these different routes than the regular thing that we do.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a really important question, because there's so many facets of, what's this big umbrella term of pharma biotech, right? That's just, that's so general, but within each company, there's, I think for a provider to be really clear about what their objectives are, what areas they're most interested in, right? And whether that's research or, it's coming on as an educational consultant and educating their peers, right? There's different avenues within the pharmaceutical or any pharmaceutical or biotech company that, once you understand how you want to participate and what's meaningful, and that's even with, like you said, making the connections, then identifying the right group or person in charge of those specific objectives, within each, and it is nebulous. It's, I think, the entire healthcare system in general, but also within a company, even within any company. I don't know all the stakeholders, right? But we obviously would know how to get, a provider who's interested in research connected to the right group. But I do think that those, having those connections is going to be more and more important, because that's when the solutions can happen, right? Where, we can really start to put heads together and resources toward, creating potentially innovations or disruptions at any point within, again, the patient continuum of care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it is in medical school and residency, the aspect of interaction with industry that's focused on is trying to prevent conflict of interest, and not to diminish it, but a lot of effort goes on that alone. of making sure that a physician is not conflicted, is not writing prescriptions they don't want, all that aspect of it, which I think also pharma is even more regulated than we are in trying to prevent that. So there's a lot of effort spent on that alone, but then not a lot of effort or education around all the other important pieces you just mentioned. Is like how do those two worlds interface? And because without doing that, I think we're not going to have any resolution to some of the problems that are facing us every day. And ultimately, it's for patient care. But then there's also the side things like physicians all becoming burnt out and having to. So it's just kind of figuring out these pieces. I think does take collaboration, which I always find when I have like a specific question and I come to you, you have like the best answers and you help put it in such a like logical sort of form of thinking about things, which is different than, if I were just going to talk to another dermatologist who only kind of has the knowledge that we have in our head and maybe not this kind of broader.
No, I was going to say, we learn from each other. And I think that's where it's at least having the interaction is so important. And to your point, in a way that doesn't cross over into something that's perceived as a conflict of interest. But I do think that not only is there that bilateral learning, but there's also resources that exist that, again, with the patient at the center that you might not know exist because, I'm not saying you, but that's actually where the conversations are really meaningful because maybe there is a pain point that the biotech or pharma industry already has dedicated resources to helping assist with. So, just from a resource perspective, whether that's brochures or things that are, disease state related, a lot of investment and time goes into that. So, I think that's where, maybe it's a new era of how do you have this interaction that, again, is mutually beneficial with the patient at the center.
And another part that I can talk to you about a lot about before too is kind of just the diversity within biotech as well.
Sure.
There's some companies that are doing it so well, which I think, this is not sponsored anyway, but I think your company does it really well. And also just, everyone we speak to is so respectful and knowledgeable. And most pharma is that way now, but there's still certain companies where structurally they're just a little bit different. So there's been changes over time that I think I've seen on the leadership side on both ends. So I'd love to kind of talk to you more about that too. It's a broad topic, but it's really kind of what changes you've seen. Also, you are just in such an amazing position and what things have led to you and your success and where you are. And then on the kind of the reverse of that, because it's sort of, I was curious because since you work with a lot of key opinion leaders and thought leaders, how that landscape is changing and like kind of who is that, thought leader we think of in our head? Like, what does that look like? And those are the kind of two different things and a little bit broad, but I'd love to get your ideas on.
Well, I love this question. I think when the first part, I hope I'm answering it well, is I really think we're on the precipice of complete a digital revolution within healthcare. And that is exciting because I think that, again, is going to bring new solutions. But to what we talked about earlier, it's so important to continue to have the partnership and the collaboration from all the key stakeholders to make sure that that's being done the right way and something that's meaningful, that actually creates meaningful change, whether that's process efficiencies or, access to care. But I do think that this is the next 5 or 10 years. I've seen that a little bit. I think, with COVID, that kind of forced, I love to see what happened with telemedicine. And, hopefully that's just a beginning.
Telemedicine was just catapulted, right, with COVID.
Completely. Yes. And that is a great example of something that, is here to stay. And, as a foundation for, again, what the forefront is, continuing to push that digital innovation, not just with patient care, but, within the manufacturers, with the pharmaceutical and biotech industry as well. And that goes into innovative ways of disseminating education, potentially with AI or gamification, which are things that I know are buzzwords, but that's really something that, as we look to different ways of creating content and disseminating that content, those are just, potential paths. I hope that answers the first part of your question. The second part of your question was about, the key opinion leader. And, I think that has also been there's so many different ways you can define that, but essentially, having the leaders within the field that are adopting new therapies, that are actually, trying to put patients, and patient care and trying to lead like what that looks like. I think that for us is really meaningful. I think the term thought leader is very subjective, but within dermatology, for us as people who are again trying to think outside of the box and really push, expand, I guess, what traditionally would have been done within, just patient continuum of care.
Yeah, and some of that is like that disruption we talked about too, right? Like a little bit of helpful disruption is good, and it might not necessarily come from the places you would think of, right? It could be someone in private practice, it could be someone in academics. The key opinion leader was maybe people in academics. They did
research,
which obviously also really makes sense because those people are usually very knowledgeable on the topic.
Right.
Of course, it makes sense, but maybe there's like these other routes that are kind of coming up too. And not to put you in the spot about that, but anything like innovative you've seen in that regard, any key opinion leaders you've kind of that come to mind for you that are not necessarily that traditional kind of route? And I'm probably super putting you on the spot now. You don't have to name these specifics.
Well, I do think, even within, it's also about subject matter expertise, right? And so that comes in various ways, like to your point, sometimes that's defined by research, if that's your subject matter expertise. But oftentimes now I've even seen some providers that actually are experts on, how do you get a prior authorization, who have become subject matter experts on digital content, who, and not necessarily just, actually like putting out medical content, through a digital medium. And so that I think has changed a little bit because it's not so global. It's almost a little bit more regional. And there's always the global too, but I think a subject matter expertise can come in a variety of different ways. And that's nice because you do get to define key opinion leader in more than one way, right? Rather than before, I think it was primarily on, publishing, which is still really important, but publishing and research.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's so interesting that I think these traditional rules are changing, and that's really kind of interesting.
Definitely.
New ideas are kind of emerging, and I think everyone's kind of more open to that. Some of the ideas, like you mentioned, like in COVID, were sort of like catapulted, where telehealth was like, well, now we're open to this. But then there's a lot of other things, and that's for me, like the technology is a great area of interest because I agree with you. I think the next 5 to 10 years or so, we're going to need all of these tech advancements. And the physicians and the stakeholders need to be ahead of the game because otherwise we end up like one of my things. I was like, I just feel like all this tech has happened to us, but without us being intimately involved. So that's another really important point is that like all of us kind of important stakeholders are involved in the evolution of the tech that we think will actually be helpful, rather than just another product that's there and not really doing much. So.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And that it comes, to the partnership between, again, like the pharma biotech industry and providers, but, all the stakeholders, right? So we can really shape what that looks like rather than, like you said, have it be a little bit more reactive.
Yeah. And then I guess just as we kind of wrap up, any specific advice you have for, let's say, a resident coming out or a young physician or mid-career physician? Like what are, I think if you're in academics and you're in the traditional route, there are routes for doing these things because they've already pre-existed. But for maybe someone that's just coming out and not knowing exactly how to engage with industry, whether that's pharma or biotech, all the different kind of external industries that comprise the business of dermatology. Any advice for just how to start or how to kind of engage in that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I definitely think, getting to know who's local in your area is kind of the key, because they can actually, again, being like we talked about, understanding what your objectives are and what you find most meaningful that you want to participate in, but using those local, whether it's representative or someone else who's actually that you're interfacing with more frequently, but they can be a connector to different functional areas within any biotech or pharma industry that would, based on the objectives that you have. So really getting to know the local representatives of the company, understanding where you want to participate and what things are the most meaningful. And then, from there, there's so many different avenues within, we only get better with the partnership from physicians. That is the way that we understand what the gaps are, where the resources are needed. So, there's all different kinds of ways that you can participate.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's so helpful. And if you're local here, of course, Vishi and her team, because you do have all the answers. Usually, whatever question I've asked, I feel like you have been like, well, this is the person to talk to, or this is the answer. So it's really true. It's that just forming those connections and relationships. And lastly, since it's the Future of Dermatology podcast, we've kind of been talking a little bit more about this anyways we've gone along, but what are you most excited about, or what major change do you think you see for the future of dermatology?
Oh, I love that question. I definitely would love to see AI come into education. I think that would be just having it 360 surround sound. That I think would be a really great disruption. So I'm looking forward to seeing that at a future conference.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's an area that's near and dear to my heart as well. So
Right.
And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. So very exciting. Any last thoughts?
No, just thank you for having me on here. I have so much respect and admiration for what you guys do every day, and just to be having this conversation is such a privilege. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Vishi. It was such a privilege to have you on as well, and all the amazing guidance. So thank you as always.